Hello, NCA. Hello, NCA. Welcome to the 2013 Carroll C. Arnold Distinguished Lecture with a word of both personal and professional gratitude to our sponsors, Pearson, Align, and Bacon. Carroll Arnold entered the world 2 years before our organization did. He modeled learning both open-minded and lifelong. For he believed that the liberal arts equip you to become your best self because they help you understand the entire world you live in. Consider not only the depth but the breadth of his scholarship. He embraced rhetorical as well as social scientific research, pedagogy as well as publication, interdisciplinary as well as intradisciplinary investigations. NCA Arnold honored Carroll Arnold as one of our first teachers on teaching. And for 20 years, we have honored distinguished scholars in the field in his name. Today, our distinguished scholar is Dr. Eric King Watts of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's too bad they don't like you, Eric. His scholarship focuses on how public voice is invented, performed, consumed, and suppressed. Dr. Watts embraces the connections among rhetoric, aesthetics, literary studies, and critical media studies to explore African-American public voice. And he does so in contexts as diverse as W.E.B. Du Bois, the awkward racial geography of Eminem's 8 Mile, hip-hop, and the Budweiser "What's Up" commercials. In the process, he uses deliciously lyrical language, from his comparing the term of voice in rhetorical studies to Halley's Comet, to his notion that folks who insist that the N-word has one and only one meaning remind him of his Aunt Mary's shelf of fruit and pepper preserves, tightly sealed, self-contained, and impenetrable. In his powerful and provocative book from the University of Alabama Press, Hearing the Hurt, Dr. Watts proffers a sensitive exploration of how the Harlem Renaissance created and complicated the tropes of the new Negro, what he calls a phenomenal movement of tropes of race that haunt our memories today and can still intermittently jolt us like a raw nerve. Now, I confess that when I asked Dr. Watts to serve as our honor lecturer this year, I could not have imagined that he would choose the topic of reanimating zombie voices. And I said in one of the convention newsletters that to my knowledge, Carroll Arnold never studied zombies. To which David Henry zipped a quick retort, Carroll Arnold did too study zombies. How do I know? Because Carroll Arnold studied everything. So from A to Z, from Arnold to zombies, please welcome Dr. Eric King Watts. You go, guy. Knock him dead.
Thank you, Kathy Turner, for this wonderful opportunity. I never imagined that I would get it, so I'm going to embrace it. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's quite an honor, of course, to be asked to be the 2013 Distinguished Arnold Lecturer and to be in the company of the previous Arnold lecturers and, of course, the Arnold lecturers yet to be. I want to thank all of my colleagues at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the students of the University of North Carolina for their warmth, support, and mirth as I prepared for this tremendous opportunity. Excuse me. Lastly, I want to express gratitude to Brenda Allen, Michael Hyde, and Bill Balthrop for critical commentary and counsel while I prepared these remarks. Of course, all the errors in judgment and conception are all mine and mine alone. This lecture is actually less about zombies than it is about how our political culture feels and functions today. So I have four objectives that I want to share with you. First, I argue that we're caught up in political practices and rituals that actually are eating away our commonplaces. I argue, number two, that this denial of commonality happens through a kind of excommunication that I'm calling zombie relations. Third, I argue that these zombie relations have been established as a mode of political practice in this town. And fourth, I'm going to examine these practices by endowing zombie voices and by digging up zombie histories connected to the post-racial. When my son saw me reading, when my son saw me reading the Zombie Survival Guide about a year or so ago, he was like, "Oh, cool, Dad, let me get that next." So I gave it to him. He took it a couple of days, came back, and was like, "This isn't very funny at all." I said, "Ty, I'm not really sure it's supposed to be funny." And he said, "Well, look, Dad," flipped over to the copyright page, and he said, "Humor." I said, "Indeed." I've taught him way too well. I said, "Indeed." Nearly every review of the book published in 2003 calls it tongue-in-cheek and satirical. Its author, Max Brooks, the son of Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft, strongly suggested in multiple interviews that the work probably would have just sat on his shelf if his agent hadn't finally pitched it as a parody written by a former Saturday Night Live writer. However, in multiple interviews, Max Brooks insists that we are not supposed to take it as humor. It's not supposed to be funny. He says this over and over. So I began wondering, how is a work that is pitched as satire supposed to be read seriously? And I thought there were at least three different answers for this question. One, that he actually did mean it to be funny and it's not. Two, that he actually doesn't mean it as satire. Three, however, the work itself evokes a third kind of response. Its striking resemblance to a survival guide portends parody, but it also energizes an expression and transmission of some potent primal fears that somehow dampens comedy. The Zombie Survival Guide radiates some pretty crazy affective qualities. One can at once discern it as a farce and earnestly engage it as it explicates techniques for surviving the zombie apocalypse. For example, some posts to survivalistboards.com fleetingly noted its silliness while offering extended commentary on the tactics that it offers for avoiding being eaten. Brooks has come under fire from gun lobbyists, and not because he's a New York City liberal either. He had the un-American audacity to grade the Soviet AK-47 as far superior to the M16 when cutting down zombies. Nevertheless, following the release of the work, Brooks was a popular lecture draw in places like Texas and Utah, where in an interview he said, "All the survivalists hang out there. Why the red states love me, I don't know." This affection has been infectious, becoming airborne with the publication of the epic World War Z, the book's translation into a film by Brad Pitt, and the inking of another film deal for the animated sequel to Zombie Survival Guide called Recorded Attacks. Clearly, Brooks's fame cannot be dissociated from the global obsession with the zombie. His point of contact with this unprecedented interest in this monstrous icon underwrites an intriguing problematic for communication studies. A casual survey of popular opinion about zombies yields something like this: they eat brains, they are undead, they transmit a hideous contagion when they bite. Michael Jackson's Thriller notwithstanding, they don't have much rhythm. They shamble awkwardly and disjointedly, except, of course, as you know, when they're sprinting at you maddeningly. Their presence in our imaginaries is paradoxically contingent on an absence. They supposedly have no minds, no consciousness, no souls. Our newly intensified enjoyment of them in literature, film, and television purportedly reflects our post-9/11 nervousness. They embody abjection as revolting and broad-based as to be capable of nearly bearing up all of our fears and desires. The films of George Romero are routinely credited with birthing the genre. Recent scholarship on the subject contends that zombies are eating machines, grotesque metaphors for ravenous consumption and the appetites of late capitalism. It's important in my talk that the zombie is also considered to be speech impaired. The zombie literature is consistent on the speechlessness of this undead ghoul. While the Zombie Survival Guide falls in line with the wordlessness of zombies, it accentuates the potential for zombie voice. So there are 4 lessons of the Zombie Survival Guide I want to glean for you that are important today. If you use the Zombie Survival Guide as it's meant to be, as a home defense workbook, you first will always be prepared for a long siege. Secondly, you will stockpile a diverse cache of arms, but you must remember that nothing is more important than your primary firearm. The Zombie Survival Guide teaches you how to read the signs of zombie trouble through the media. And if you read the signs, you can see there is always zombie trouble. So therefore, you come to the conclusion that the dead have risen, and it's now time to do battle against the living dead. It's absolutely crucial that the undead never be identified as remotely human. That bloody stump banging on the window does not now belong to Bucky, the grizzled ex-Marine from across the street. He's gone. And what remains is just a putrid meat sack that will take everything away from you if you let it. It's not enough to keep its body at bay. Its sonic force must be negated entirely. To this end, Brooks advises that you keep your earplugs handy and use them often. This counsel is striking for zombie tales. It also delivers us to the threshold of the zombie problematic for communication studies. The danger of hearing too much. Brooks elaborates. The constant collective moan of the undead, a sound that will persist at all hours for as long as the siege continues, can be a deadly form of psychological warfare. People with well-protected, well-supplied homes have been known to either kill one another or go insane simply from the incessant moan. What is it about this undead sound that it must be smothered to ensure one's survival? I'm not going to put you through that through the entire talk, although I did think about it. Could it be the zombie wail threatens our fortifications because it is closely associated with being in distress? The sonorous nature of the siege is a breach in itself precisely because it offers a point of affective contingency for human and zombie. The zombie's supposed mindlessness is transfused with the survivalist mindfulness, bringing about the sort of disorienting conjunction that Joshua Gunn argued is responsible for producing bodies and feeling. The connection radiates a haunting reminder of precarious life and a palpable remainder of speech. The moan expresses a social diminishment and banishment. By hearing the moan too much, a dreadful relation is reawakened. While exploring the growing tendency for scientists, public policy experts, and World Health professionals to use horror stories as data for experimental models testing institutional responses to things like plague, the science editor of the Daily Mail opined that a series of equations and graphs show how the human-zombie coexistence is impossible. And yet, this impossible relation has seized the imaginations of philosophers and cultural critics, anthropologists, political scientists, economists, historians, and mathematicians. It's important to note that Brooks did not write the zombie survival guide in response to 9/11, as people kind of presume. He wrote it in response to Y2K. There were all of these survival guides hitting the shelves as Y2K approached, and he said they were just getting crazier and crazier. And so he decided to write what he was afraid of. So what is Brooks afraid of? I don't know what's scarier, he said in an interview. The fact that zombies could rise, or the fact that there are people out there that can't wait for it to happen. The rest of the lecture unfolds in two parts. I will first revive our memories of zombies lost and forgotten by reanimating the Afro-Caribbean zombie. I will then return to the zombie survival guide as a coordinate in a field of discourses expressing panic and paranoia over Obamacare. There's a pretty creepy correspondence between the two economic collapses that we call great. The Great Depression and our Great Recession can be juxtaposed not only because each era was marked by financial collapse, a lesser recognized resemblance can be apprehended through the zombie relation. Each historical moment bore witness to an outbreak of tropes of the zombie, expressing angst associated with the post-racial. In some important ways, the Great Depression inaugurated the Western imaginary's love-hate affair with zombies, but we don't generally associate that time period with what we call the post-racial, as we do with the Obama era. George Schuyler's New Negro novel, however, Black No More, clearly sutures the idea of a post-racial world with the zombie. Published in 1931, this send-up depicts white supremacists and black civil rights activists joining forces to conserve the idea of race while it was trying to be erased due to German engineering. Black folk from coast to coast stampede to Black No More sanitariums, hungry for a medical procedure that lightens one's skin so as to escape Jim Crow. Inspired by the quasi-science of eugenics of the time, Black No More techniques isolate and electronically stimulate what is called a nervous disease to turn skin white. Fear and anxiety grip certain sections of white America. Meanwhile, an optimistic mood associated with hope and change resonates through wide swaths of Black America. Black No More is a post-racial narrative in the sense that it imagines what might happen when the chief sign of racial difference goes away. It is also populated with figures and images consistent with late 19th century and early 20th century's sense of the zombie slave. The work also gestures to our contemporary freak show starring the flesh eater. For instance, the novel insists that the operation excites an epidermal cannibalism. Poor white people, dreading the end of an authentically white America, are depicted quite specifically as being zombie slaves. Schuyler imagines them to be mindless laborers in a culture war. Concurrent with the publication of Schuyler's novel, the Halperin brothers produced and independently released the film White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi. Set in an unspecified tropical paradise and hellish labor camp, White Zombie depicts the machinations of Murder Legendre, a mysterious zombie master appropriating and unleashing Black folk knowledge to covet Madeline, the fiancée of a guest to his lush estate, and turn her into a zombie sex slave. Legendre commands an army of zombie slaves to gain and safeguard a spice empire. These dumb workers are also subject to being ingested by the colonial machinery, as is shown in a shadowy scene where one mill hand falls into the sugar grinder and is pulverized, his body offering a gruesome seasoning. Many critics have noted anxiety stemming from class, labor, race, and xenophobia animating the film. These apprehensions bear a strong family resemblance to those in Black No More. Each text's affective apparatus hinges in part on the loss of certainty regarding status and power due to a precarious racial order. I want to summarize two issues here that link the zombie slave to the flesh eater to the post-racial. First, the flesh eater and the zombie slave are of the same genus. Much contemporary writing on the zombie tends to treat the zombie slave as a precursor to the carnivore, based on the notion that the zombie slave signified coerced labor and was induced by pre-modern black magic, voodoo, while the biter was twisted by modern science into a hungry mouth. However, both of these works show that the specter of oppressed labor already haunts horrific rituals of bodily consumption. So we must acknowledge that current grotesque displays of bodily mutilation and ingestion, conveniently indexed often to Romero's Night of the Living Dead and presented in shows like AMC's The Walking Dead, are preoccupied with repeating this long-standing insidious relation between avarice and abject labor. Secondly, the post-racial does not refer to a transcendence of racial structures or feelings. It registers extreme foreboding and optimism regarding how rapid social change might transmute the racial order. And second, it notates hysterical attempts by racial chauvinists on both sides to fabricate new political and economic alignments among competing interests so as to resuscitate the privileges and the disadvantages of the old order. In short, post-racial is the name presently assigned to these intense experiences that are long-standing and repetitive. These concerns can be traced to the colonial invention of the very idea of the Caribbean as a space of tropical delicacies for North American and European consumption. The exploitation and mutilation of labor and the severely felt potential of white insolvency. Schuyler was not oblivious to this context. As a keen journalist of U.S. political affairs, Schuyler was knowledgeable of the implications of U.S. occupation of Haiti between 1915 and 1934. As a critic of the New Negro movement, he mapped the ways that cultural outlets like the Guggenheim Foundation conspired for and against New Negro artists and intellectuals like Zora Neale Hurston for their access to this emerging Black republic. Many of the earliest and most widely circulated images of Haitian culture, voodoo priests, and zombies were invented and moved through networked archival projects of that kind. As for White Zombie, it is important not because it's the first film illustrating the zombie. Rather, its significance is due to its unabashed demonstration of the integral role that empire played in popularizing the zombie. The making of the Caribbean as an exotic space of warm sunshine, sweet fruit, and chocolate was bound up with the fabrication of the white imperial self. Lurking in the shadows, however, were feverish nightmares concerning white degeneration, infection, and Black suffering bodies. The space of this lecture is wholly inadequate for an explication of this difficult and complex history, but I want to briefly introduce 3 topics integral to the invention of what we call today the Caribbean. First, we should note how our appreciation of the tropics is organized by the metaphor of consumption, by insatiable appetites and fears of being eaten. Second, we must ponder how this bodily breakdown corresponds to the presumed and actual transmission of pathogens and disease. Third, we should note how laboring Black and brown bodies were effectively reduced to the status of the raw materials that they worked, how laborers became objects that made other things, and how they could be utterly unmade as things. Under different circumstances, it might be amusing to imagine Christopher Columbus, lost and confused, meeting native folk in the Indies and thinking that they were the ones that were primitive. But that's what he did, and he was not alone. Just as peculiar was the sentiment that these savages were also cannibals, and if given the chance, would gobble up the white conqueror. Of course, we all know that it was the colonizer who would do the eating and the raping. Mimi Scheller put the matter like this: in this pornotropics, the crisis of male imperial identity was warded off by naming the unknown as cannibal, by thereby confessing a dread that the unknown might literally rise up and devour the intruder whole. The imperial craving for goods not found in Europe was an impetus for constituting the Caribbean as a place served up by Providence itself, as full of delicious things to eat. This delectability was raced, sexed, and held an imminent risk of infection, contamination, and illness. It also energized a potent principle of volatile convertibility that shows itself linguistically in the term tropic, stemming from a Greek term meaning turning or being turned. Tropical consumption is wound up in its gut, if you will, by a restless feeling that the eaten can become the eater, then health can suddenly become sickness, that master can be made to kneel to slave. This fear of being turned is imminent to appreciating the zombie relation. Considered as a crucible for imperial subjectivity, the Caribbean provoked torturous and unwanted reflection on the moral limits of limitless consumption. A recurring thematic of such contemplation was the spread of disease and rapid degeneration, which brings us to the second topic. In migrating to the tropics and becoming slave owners, white colonials placed their bodies at risk. Besides the risks of fevers and death, they risked the effects of their unfettered exercise of coercion over enslaved bodies, with all the associated excesses of lust and power. The risks faced by the white imperial body were mutated, and injected back into the tropical social body in the form of deadly new pathogens and feral animals, which together decimated native populations. My point is that anxious encounters with dark bodies, pleasures of gluttony, and imagined degeneration of the social body brought about through widespread sickness are acute symptoms of the zombie relation. The third topic of invention was made manifest through colonial labor practices. Since much of the indigenous population of the Caribbean islands was killed off after Columbus and other early explorers from Europe arrived, the tropics were repopulated through a surge in West African slave imports. A global demand for foodstuffs shaping the Caribbean was energized by rapacious appetites for exotic images, folklore, plants, and bodies. The fabulous wealth acquired through imperial possession was imprinted by aesthetic values produced by making extraordinary racial distinctions linked to body parts. One of the more savory ingredients of the Caribbean came in the form of the zombie slave, which seemed to embody the backwardness of Black people, the mysterious capacity to bend people to the will of a secret sorcerer, the fantastic promise of a permanently laboring body, and the threat of losing one's freedom. The zombie figured a dreadful contingency. Anyone can be turned into a mindless slave. Elysium can degenerate into perdition, where previously condemned souls may mobilize as the undead. By the time the United States put marine boots on the ground in Haiti in the second decade of the 20th century, fantasies of Black laboring bodies had been mutated by the slow decay of the slave trade, the abolition of slaves, and the emergence of class struggles, heightening anxieties regarding the insolvency of empire. The zombie helped bring to life the modern horror genre at the very moment that an economic catastrophe formed a conjuncture with what felt like unprecedented Black sovereignty. Tropes of the zombie capture and release these impressive affective pulses. I have written elsewhere that voice is the sound of the affective outburst, and that voice can be endowed by a public acknowledgement of the ethical implications of these affective economies for the social body. I've also consistently maintained that the metaphor of the social body urges attention to the vitality and the health of the social. And we all know that if one can't afford a doctor's visit, one can't expect the physician to listen intensely to the breath and the breathing of one's body. So, despite serious risk of infection and insanity, let us put away the earplugs and endow zombie voices. Writing in the New York Times about the relationship between the popularity of zombies and the dull, undead sensation of modernity, Chuck Klosterman posed this question, quote, "What if the contemporary people are less interested in seeing depictions of their unconscious fears and more attracted to allegories of how their day-to-day existence feels?" What if indeed? But there's no reason to offer a more or less scenario. The Zombie Survival Guide proves this point nicely because it expresses both the heart-pounding exhilaration of imagining fighting for one's life and the tedium of constant preparation. If we can say that the Zombie Survival Guide is an allegory of how some survivalists experience their day-to-day existence, what might we make of the Obamacare Survival Guide and its related texts? The book's aesthetics are important. They formally link together the hatred and fear of Barack Obama, a deep-seated, long-standing suspicion of government, and the primal urgency of sickness and health. These generic formations also find sympathetic treatment in the Zombie Survival Guide and can be succinctly stated like this: disaster is looming. Arm yourself and be prepared to protect your family. By exploring these formal resemblances between the Zombie Survival Guide and the Obamacare Survival Guide, we can appreciate some dreadful zombie relations. The vitriol stirred by Obamacare has not only been ignited by misgivings over an overhaul of the national health care delivery system. Crucially, it is also about what counts as a body worthy of care. Who gets to count the worthwhile and worthless bodies? And how does one even speak about such brutal forms of dehumanization and exclusion? In the time I have remaining, I'll comment on each of these aspects in turn, articulated to survivalism, zombies, and Obamacare. In Colson Whitehead's introspective zombie novel, Zone 1, our hero fondly recalls watching nuclear war movies with his father before the undead began to feast upon the living. On one such occasion, he asks his dad, "Hey, Dad, what does the apocalypse mean?" His father offers this definition to the reader from the grave: "It means that in the future, things will be even worse than they are now." In that even worse future, where humans struggle to carve safe zones out of zombie-infested cities and countrysides, every survivor suffers from PASD, post-apocalyptic stress disorder. We too suffer from an apocalyptic stress condition that is recurring and enduring, and that might be appropriately called perennial apocalyptic stress disorder. This malady is metastasized in zombie relations, emerging in and around discourses about healthcare and the general well-being of the social body. Endorsed by right-wing pundits like Dick Morris and Michael Regan, Obamacare Survival Guide positions you and your family as survivalists against the awful encroachment of 30 million ravenous healthcare consumers whose inclusion into the insurance pool will bring about a social breakdown, beginning, of course, with healthcare rationing. But since this work links to other texts depicting a wasteland in 2014, it provokes concerns over basic resources like clean water and food. Apparently, under Obamacare, the Hippocratic Oath will become a toxic spew that should not be put in one's mouth, resulting in 40% of doctors quitting clinical practice. The allegory is inhumane and horrific. The uninsured are considered alive, yet already spent. Steve Shaviro understands this predicament as zombie labor, where working bodies accrue bills they can never pay, deemed to flounder in eternal indebtedness. The Obamacare Survival Guide imagines the zombie slave and the diseased carnivore as one and the same, and they are. But I'm not principally concerned with the dystopic imaginaries of the right or the left. I'm talking about the political economic conditions and the fearful connections provoking widespread zombification. When Rush Limbaugh bemoaned Obama's election as the sign of a perpetual underclass enslaved to the Democratic Party, and when Michelle Bachmann in July 2010 echoed this fear, citing Obama's election as the crisis moment that America's enslavement began, we cannot afford to simply tune them out. We must note two vital concerns. First, they are producing for public consumption a racist equation, palpably fomenting the belief that a black president signals white disfranchisement and perhaps the end of white America itself. And because this inverse has at times been historically true, such sick thinking can be described by Daniel Dresner as a patina of plausibility. Second, this tactic is part of the playbook of the new hate. It is also a modality of post-racial reactionary politics, where the old is made new again and again and again and again. Arthur Goldwag explains the objective. But logic and sense, he writes, are completely beside the point when the object is not to make people think, but to frighten and confuse them so they won't think, but merely react. In The Rise of the Tea Party, Anthony DiMaggio labels this discourse propagandistic and notes that at the very moment that the Tea Party was manufactured by conservative elite actors like Dick Armey, formerly of the Freedom Works, the Congressional Republican Conference experienced one of its sharpest right turns ever. The Obamacare Survival Guide necessarily installs the president as zombie in chief and conjures those who support the Affordable Care Act or something even more radical like a public option as zombies themselves whose collective incessant moan should be snuffed out. But remember, I'm talking about zombie relations here. So let's turn it around. An acknowledgement of the incessant moan of the Tea Party allows us to hear the hurt of people who are themselves zombified by practices of conservative plutocrats and media celebrities whose material interests don't match up to their base. The apocalyptic theater of Obamacare calls up the human-zombie impossible relation as a mode of politics meant to deliver to us the disaster that we fear. In such a war zone, we all become survivalists in tribes, refusing to grant a modicum of humanity to those we hate and fear, fixing rather our laser sights on headshots. Zombie relations are sustained by anger, terror, and the unreliability of a living wage. Zombie relations are therefore experienced as a human existential diminishment. The Obamacare Survival Guide is published by Humanix Books, an imprint of the conservative web-based portal Newsmax, and is thus profoundly skeptical of the state regulation and expansion of the healthcare marketplace. The derision is shaped by perennial apocalyptic stress disorder gripping the Capitol. Tea Party congressional members suggest that we ought to get used to sequestration levels of federal spending while leading, literally, life-threatening assaults on the poor and the unemployed through austerity, resulting in what Kevin Drum has called death by 1,000 cuts. The exact number of wounds is not nearly as important, by the way, as the repetition of the wounding. This reiteration of laceration resembles the 40-plus House votes to kill Obamacare. The excessive repetition of beating Obamacare to death, including the shutdown of the government to defund it, is part of a bludgeoning ritual that expresses a visceral pleasure when performed over and over and over. Not only are the underinsured and the uninsured apparently worth less than zombie relations, the Obama administration has no status as an agency of change. The zombie relation incites contingencies of violence and profit-making. We should recall how the Zombie Survival Guide schools the reader on the proper vigilance, training, and firepower needed to survive a siege. The Obamacare Survival Guide may conjure the memory of commercial images for target practice zombies said to resemble President 44. Perhaps we have arrived once again at an historical moment when passion toward a symbol of change, Barack Obama, threatens to eat away the social body. I admit I've been caught up with that passion before. I suggested a few years ago that the far right seemed full of crazies who had become infected with the virulent strain of racism. Frequently, C-SPAN looks more like FearNet as zombies lurch through the halls of the Capitol, driven by a mad impulse to devour the social body, symbolized, of course, by Barack Obama's dark body. And as this contagion is transmitted through right-wing media, the Republican Party itself, as Thomas E. Mann and Norman J. Ornstein have lamented, has been turned into a radical insurgent, ushering in, quote, a level of political dysfunction clearly greater than at any point in our lifetimes. Tribal politics at the national level, they say, has metastasized to many states and localities and has affected the broader public as well. The glue that binds Americans together is in danger of eroding. Rush Limbaugh, prominent apocalyptic prophet, repeatedly fulminates that Tea Partiers in Congress have no reason to work with the Democrats because we have nothing in common with them. That's right, nothing. No shared history or future, no common love for democracy, no common reverence for the law. Human-zombie coexistence is impossible. Among other things ailing Limbaugh, he seems to have come down with the case of what Jeremy Ingalls termed demophobia, a condition predisposed in those harboring derision for the masses and known to flare up when the rich don't like the way elections turn out. But some elections can be made to come out just right. Writing in defense of political compromise, Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson remind us that compromise does not so much presume a common ground as much as it makes the common ground through the actual production of shared values in compromise. The failure to make Obama a one-term president did not dissolve the zombie relation, it strengthened that relation's uncompromising mindset. It strengthened that relation's uncompromising mindset, and it was hardened through gerrymandering electoral safe zones. The data is quite clear regarding the homogeneous demography of those districts. Their fortifications intensify the feeling that one's world is under siege, and as Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead consistently maintains, all that matters then is the survival of my people. This polarized attitude is heated until fervent and shaped by military metaphors to the point that the suggestion of negotiation is interpreted as capitulation and surrender. And as you know, just yesterday, we are apparently at nuclear war with one another. But zombie relations transmit contagions through the social body. Mark Leibovich has rattled some cages in this town by positing this mindset, and as we can see, it's typical on both sides, in both houses. Leibovich echoes Max Brooks's description of the proper attitude one must adapt to stay free of teeth, saying that what Reed believes most is maximum security and ultimately survival. Human-zombie coexistence is apparently impossible. Anxieties resonate in zombie relations precisely because these points of contact are also short-circuited connections. These intense affective currents riveting us in these relations must be interrupted. Part of the problem, of course, is human nature itself, because we would prefer to kill the switch. We would prefer to mute the volume. But we cannot insulate nor soundproof our lives. The task of acknowledging the incessant moan and reanimating zombie voices seems foolhardy if we become habituated to the repetitive violence toward those we consider to be zombies. Reawakening voice encourages a commitment to a fundamental understanding that we are all already infected. We are the walking dead. Such recognition does not necessarily signal resignation. But as Paul Gilroy recently commented about xenophobia in the UK, it does underline a growing sense that analyses forged in order to make sense of earlier struggles may have reached the end of their use. I agree. If we give in to the mentality that our survival depends on the annihilation of zombies, we succumb to a self-mutilating logic. We confuse people with things, and we embrace the idea that survival is a war of attrition, a numbers game. Gilroy puts the problem correctly. New interpretive tools will be needed if we are going to evaluate the political impact of these transmissions and comprehend the communicative and psychosocial networks that they assemble or animate. Such analytical innovation should begin by recalling that the zombie slave is with us now and was always a trickster, a resourceful body enslaved in chains. When we think of the incessant moan as the sound merely of an expired consciousness, as a death rattle without end, we don't hear the aspiration of the slave to pass along a secret code to us, the living. The moan is, after all, incessant for a reason. Endowing voice revives that spirit, but it requires courage and tolerance, y'all, because we have to be prepared to endure the sounds of stuff we find awful, hateful, distasteful, as well as the things that we treasure and are charmed by. The theme of this year's gathering is connections. I've been discussing a potent one, the transfer point between bodies where one risks being turned. Voice is the sound of that affective contingency and announces the humanity of us all. A vital question remains, however, what kind of person, group, community, nation, and world will we become? At present, we seem hell-bent on allowing an impoverished global order to take hold. Recall Max Brooks's fear provoking him to write the Zombie Survival Guide, that some people can't wait for that to happen. The hero in Zone 1 knows why. The secret murderers, dormant rapists, and latent fascists were now free to express their ruthless natures. The interpretive tools that Gilroy rightly calibrates as the work of communication have to be designed with such callousness and brutality in mind. This was our mindset when NCA's Legislative Assembly passed a resolution 3 years ago condemning extended solitary confinement and torture. Perhaps this must be our attitude once again as we try to reimagine the art of survival. We can't be content with reproving the spread of the contagion, however. We must go after it at its source by specifying the conditions of its transmission. We have recently seen a strengthened connection between public policy making and what Gene and John Komaroff call magical thinking. This toxic link is made up of selling conspiracy theories as news, composing alternate histories and publishing them in textbooks, and marketing hate as a popular form of entertainment. Our task is imposing, but it is also inspiring. And it has recently reanimated history as well. March, Book 1, is the graphic novel in the first of a trilogy that retells Congressman John Lewis's lifetime struggle for human rights. In a recent interview, he discussed its central lesson, its secret code. We have to learn to see our attacker, real or imagined, he said, as fundamentally a human being. Ideas matter because they are infectious. Lewis was inspired by the 1958 comic book Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story, which was a kind of how-to survival guide for its time. Let us be resolved this day forward to composing and teaching new kinds of how-to guides based not on merely survival, but on living. Thank you.
I know many of you are hungry to be further infected with Dr. Watt's subversive ideas, so I invite you to lurch your way back into this room tomorrow at 11 a.m. for a conversation with our Arnold lecturer. In the meantime, don't you know that Carroll Arnold is smiling? We are profoundly grateful to Dr. Watts for his wonderful insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh my
Take that
God.
out of the picture.
Thank you.
You don't want
Oh, this is
okay,
so
you can have
nice.
that back now.
Thank you, I need it. Oh, that was okay.
It was oh my God. No, that was fabulous.